They locked the door behind me as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, thunder rumbling low in the distance like a warning I couldn't ignore. My daughter's voice came through the glass window, sharp and cold, as if the storm wasn't outside but inside her heart. "Maybe next time you'll think before mouthing off," she said, her eyes barely meeting mine, as if she was already picturing the relief of shutting me out forever. The night air was thick and damp against my skin, the cold rain soaking through my thin cardigan. But what froze me wasn't the weather. It was the realization that the family I had spent decades building, nurturing, and sacrificing for had decided I was no longer welcome under their roof. I stood there, shivering, the storm growing fiercer, as their silhouettes disappeared into the warm glow of the living room, leaving me to face the tempest alone. I am 78 years old now, and I live in a small rented apartment above a laundromat, where the hum of washing machines is the loudest company I keep. The windows here do not frame manicured lawns or polished hardwood floors, but a worn-out street and the steady shuffle of neighbors who barely notice me. The days are quieter now, marked by the ritual of folding laundry and watching the occasional passerby. But that night, years ago, when they left me outside, it felt as if the world itself had cracked open beneath my feet, and I was tumbling into an abyss of loneliness and betrayal. I remember every detail: the creak of the old wooden door as it closed, the sharp click of the lock turning, the flash of the lightning that illuminated their faces through the glass, cold and unyielding. It wasn't the first time I had felt invisible, but it was the first time they made it so clear that my presence was no longer wanted. The house, the one I had helped buy with my late husband's savings, the home where my grandchildren's laughter once echoed through the halls, had become a fortress built against me. For years I had quietly weathered the subtle shifts in tone, the sideways glances, the conversations that stopped when I entered the room. But this was a deliberate, cruel severing. The rain soaked my hair and trickled down my face, mixing with tears I refused to shed. I was not a woman who cried in public, not anymore. I had spent a lifetime holding things together: the family dinners, the birthday parties, the broken hearts and scraped knees. I had been the quiet strength behind every celebration, the one who fixed what was broken and made sure everyone felt loved, even when I wasn't. Yet here I was, standing in the cold, abandoned like a piece of trash no one wanted to touch. The irony was bitter. After decades of giving, after every sacrifice, after every night spent awake worrying about their futures, I was cast out in the storm, told with silence and locked doors that I was a problem best left outside. It wasn't always this way. Once, this house was filled with warmth. My late husband and I had dreamed of it, worked for it, and raised our son within its walls. It had the creaky floors and narrow hallways of a family home, not the sterile, curated spaces of the life my daughter and her husband had now claimed. There were pictures on the walls, faded photographs of birthdays and Christmas mornings, school plays and first steps, evidence of a life lived in love and imperfection. But over time, those pictures were replaced by sleek frames and abstract art, the memories hidden behind modern veneers. And me? I became a guest in my own home, an afterthought in a place I once called sanctuary. I had come to visit, or so I thought. They said it was just for the weekend, a chance to catch up, to see the new neighborhood, to meet the friends my son's wife had made. They had prepared the guest room with clean sheets and fresh towels, but no warmth. The house smelled faintly of disinfectant and expensive candles, a scent designed to mask anything real or messy. I unpacked my bag slowly, laying out the clothes I had brought, the ones my daughter had said were too old-fashioned, but I liked anyway. I tried to hold myself steady, to be the pleasant, easy grandmother they wanted me to be, the one who smiled and nodded and kept her opinions to herself. But I had forgotten how heavy the silence could be when it was filled with unspoken judgments. The first night, they gathered in the living room, the soft murmur of their conversation just beyond my bedroom door. I could hear laughter, but it felt forced, like a stage play. At one point, I heard my daughter's voice, sharp, clipped, talking about boundaries and space. I didn't understand at first, but soon enough, the words found their meaning. I was the one who was out of place, the one who needed to be kept at arm's length. When I stepped into the hallway the next morning, I noticed my favorite chair had been replaced with a sleek, backless stool. My tea set was missing from the kitchen shelf, and the small stack of newspapers I had left in the living room had vanished. These were small things, but they cut deep, each one a silent message. You do not belong here anymore. I tried to speak up once, a quiet question about the house repairs I had paid for, or the garden my husband had planted before he died. My daughter's husband laughed and told me to let the past stay buried, and my daughter smiled at him like a schoolgirl pleased with a teacher's praise. The warmth I had hoped for was replaced by a cold calculation. They had already decided who I was in their lives now, a burden, a problem, a shadow to be managed rather than a mother or grandmother to be loved. Days passed in this strange, painful limbo. I found myself retreating to the garden, sitting among the hydrangeas and azaleas, watching the neighbors go about their polished lives. Sometimes they glanced my way, their eyes filled with pity or discomfort. I knew what they thought, that I was an old woman who had lost her place, who was being quietly pushed aside for the sake of convenience and appearances. It was humiliating, but beneath it all, a quiet rage began to build. This was not how my story would end, not with me forgotten in the rain, discarded like a worn-out coat. That night the storm returned. Thunder cracked overhead as I stood by the garden gate, rain washing over my face and hands. I heard the door lock behind me again, the sound final and unforgiving. The house was silent. The lights dimmed as if to erase my existence. I wrapped my cardigan tighter, the cold seeping into my bones. But inside me, a fire was kindling. I would not be a ghost. I would not disappear quietly. I am not a woman who has given up. This night, this storm, was not the end. It was a beginning. The night before everything changed, the house was alive with voices and laughter. But beneath the surface, tension hummed like an unseen current. The family had gathered for what was supposed to be a celebration, an excuse to come together, to share a meal and catch up on life's small triumphs and struggles. My daughter had prepared the table meticulously, laying out the china and silverware with precision, arranging flowers I had given her years ago when she first moved into that house. There were candles lit, casting soft pools of light, but even their gentle glow could not mask the coldness that had settled between us. I could feel it in the clipped responses, the sidelong glances, the hurried steps around me. I had come expecting warmth, but found only a carefully crafted distance. The evening began with small talk, polite smiles, and questions about my health and my days. I answered with the patience and grace I had always tried to carry, but I sensed the disinterest beneath the words, as if my presence was more an obligation than a welcome. Then, as the meal progressed, the moment arrived, a seemingly small slip that would unravel the fragile facade. I asked about a detail in the family finances, a question that had nothing to do with me but everything to do with the truth. I inquired gently about the monthly expenses on the new house renovations, something I had contributed to quietly over the years. The answer came back quick and sharp, not from my daughter, but from her husband, who smirked as he dismissed me with a sarcastic remark about how Mom didn't need to concern herself with grown-up matters anymore. That was the spark. I felt the eyes around the table shift, the smiles falter, and the warmth drain away. My daughter, instead of speaking for me or diffusing the tension, leaned forward with a cold smile that did not reach her eyes and said, "This is my house now. You don't get to embarrass my husband at my table." The words landed like a hammer, heavy and deliberate. The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken accusations and the weight of a decision already made. I swallowed the hurt that rose in my throat and looked at them all. The faces I had loved and trusted, now turned against me. The woman who was supposed to be my daughter had drawn a line, and I was on the other side of it. After dinner, when the dishes were cleared away, the mood did not lighten. Instead, it tightened like a noose. I was asked to step outside for a moment, to give them some space, my daughter said, her voice strained but firm. I obeyed, confused but trying to believe in the promise that I would be called back soon. I wrapped myself in my cardigan and stepped out into the night, the door closing softly behind me, but echoing like a verdict. The sky was dark, clouds rolling in with the promise of rain. I stood on the porch, the chill seeping into my bones, waiting. Minutes passed, then an hour, then more. No one came to fetch me. The house, once a sanctuary, was now a fortress locked tight against me. The rain started as a drizzle and quickly became a downpour. Thunder growled overhead, the storm intensifying as if nature itself had taken pity on me, or perhaps mirrored my turmoil. I sat on the cold stone steps, soaked through, the dampness clinging to my skin and clothes. I called out softly at first, then louder, but my voice was swallowed by the night. No footsteps answered. No door opened. I realized then, with a sinking heart, that this was not an accident or a misunderstanding. This was punishment. A lesson I was meant to learn in the cold and the dark. The storm was no longer just outside. It was inside me, raging and relentless. Inside, the family carried on, pretending everything was normal. The laughter resumed, louder this time, as if to drown out the shame of what they had done. I imagined their voices, carried faintly through the windows, discussing plans and futures that no longer included me. My daughter's husband made jokes at my expense, careful to keep the tone light but sharp enough to cut. The neighbors, perhaps aware of the drama unfolding, said nothing. They watched from behind curtains and blinds, unwilling or afraid to intervene. I felt like a spectacle, a cautionary tale whispered among those who feared aging and dependency, a woman who had outstayed her welcome. The hours passed slowly. I shivered beneath my wet cardigan, muscles stiff from sitting still in the cold. The storm showed no sign of abating, lightning flashing and thunder crashing with growing fury. My thoughts turned inward. How had it come to this? How had the family I had sacrificed for, who had eaten my cooking, worn my hand-knitted sweaters, called me mom and grandma so many times, turned so quickly to strangers? I thought of the birthdays I had planned, the nights spent awake worrying about illnesses and school troubles, the countless ways I had tried to hold us all together, and now I was cast out like an unwelcome guest, left to the mercy of the rain and the dark. When the door finally opened hours later, I was numb. My daughter stood there, umbrella in hand, her expression unreadable. She did not apologize. She did not ask if I was all right. She simply said, "Come in. You're dripping everywhere." Her tone was flat, void of warmth or concern. I stood, too cold and exhausted to argue, and let her lead me inside. The house was still bright, the air warm and dry. Inside, the family had gathered in the living room, eyes quickly turning away as I entered, as if I had brought the storm with me. No one spoke of what had happened. The night passed in silence, the tension palpable but unaddressed. In the days that followed, the pattern settled into a cold routine. I was present but invisible, a ghost haunting the rooms where memories once lived. My daughter avoided my gaze, her husband's smiles never quite reaching his eyes. Family photos were rearranged to minimize my presence. Invitations to outings stopped coming. Phone calls from my grandchildren became rare and brief, if they came at all. I was left with the echo of that stormy night, a reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. Outsider, inconvenience, burden. The betrayal cut deeper because it was so deliberate, so calculated. It was not the anger of a sudden fight, but the quiet, steady exclusion that eroded my sense of belonging. The family had drawn boundaries, and I was left to navigate the cold edges alone. Their rejection was a lesson written in thunder and rain, a punishment for speaking out, for refusing to fade quietly into the background. And yet beneath the pain, something stirred, a fierce determination not to be broken by their cruelty. That night in the storm, as the thunder rolled and the rain poured down, I understood that my life had shifted irrevocably. The family I had known was no longer my refuge. The home I had helped build had become a cage. But I was still here, still standing, and if they thought they could teach me a lesson by leaving me out in the cold, they had only ignited a fire within me that would burn brighter than any storm. After that stormy night, the cold silence settled over the house like a thick fog that refused to lift. The family no longer spoke of what had happened, but the consequences of that evening were visible in the smallest details of everyday life. It was not a dramatic confrontation or a fiery argument that followed, but rather a slow, quiet erosion of my place within the home and the family I had once known. The very fabric of my life was unraveling, thread by thread, until I felt as though I were being erased, not with a shout, but with a whisper. The morning after I was let back inside, I noticed the first subtle shift. My favorite armchair was gone, the one where I had spent countless hours knitting and reading, the chair that had cradled me through late nights and early mornings. In its place stood a sleek modern stool with no back, designed more for style than comfort. When I asked about it, my daughter glanced at her husband and said lightly, "We thought you might like something more, contemporary." The words hung in the air like a gentle dismissal, but the message was clear. My comfort, my preferences, no longer mattered. It wasn't just the furniture. My personal belongings began to disappear or be moved without explanation. The tin where I kept my special tea, a ritual that gave me a moment of peace each afternoon, vanished from the kitchen shelf. The stack of newspapers I read each morning was no longer left on the coffee table. One day I realized my mail had stopped arriving. Letters from old friends, bills, catalogs, all redirected or held back by someone. When I mentioned it to my daughter, she simply said, "We're managing things for you now, Mom. You don't have to worry." But I knew better. This was control disguised as care, a way to keep me from reaching beyond the narrow confines they had set. The house itself felt different, colder somehow. The warmth of familiar smells and sounds was replaced by the sterile scent of cleaning products and the hum of appliances running on timers. The laughter that once filled the halls was now rare and clipped. I found myself wandering from room to room, searching for a place that still felt like mine, but it was as if the walls themselves were pushing me out. Family dinners became rushed affairs, where I was invited but never really included. Conversations paused when I entered, and the air seemed to tighten, as though my presence was an inconvenience to be tolerated rather than a welcome. My daughter's behavior was the most painful. Once a woman who had held my hand through difficult times, she now spoke to me with a clipped, impatient tone. She questioned my memory, my decisions, even my ability to manage small tasks. "Are you sure you took your medication today?" she would ask, not out of concern, but as if testing me. When I reached for the newspaper or tried to make a phone call, she reminded me gently, yet firmly, that we're here to help. But help felt like control, a way to keep me dependent and isolated. I noticed that my outings became fewer and fewer. Invitations to family gatherings stopped coming, and when I suggested going to the grocery store or visiting old friends, I was met with excuses or warnings about safety and weather. "You don't want to get tired, Mom," my daughter said, her eyes avoiding mine. "It's better if you stay home and rest." The message was clear. Stay put, stay quiet, stay invisible. Even the garden, once my sanctuary, was taken from me. The flowers I had planted with my own hands were uprooted or replaced with neat, low-maintenance shrubs. My tools were moved to a locked shed, and I was told it was for my safety. I spent hours sitting on the porch, watching as my world was slowly stripped away, piece by piece. The humiliation was suffocating, but the worst part was the silence, the way no one acknowledged the pain, the loss, or the betrayal. Financial control followed. My bank statements were no longer delivered to me but to my daughter's address. I was told that she was handling things now, but when I asked questions about bills or expenses, I was brushed off. "It's complicated, Mom. We'll take care of it." I felt like a child being spoken down to, my years of managing household budgets and bills dismissed as irrelevant. The money I had saved over decades, the funds I had quietly set aside for emergencies or small pleasures, were now beyond my reach. I was told to ask if I needed anything, but the message was unmistakable. I was no longer in control of my own life. In the quiet moments, when I was alone in the dim corners of the house, I felt the weight of invisibility pressing down. I was no longer a mother, no longer a grandmother who mattered. I was a problem to be managed, a delicate inconvenience who must be carefully contained. I remembered the early years, the laughter of children, the warmth of family gatherings, and I grieved, not just for what had been lost, but for what was being taken from me day by day. Yet amid the quiet humiliation, a small flame of resistance flickered within me. I began to pay attention to the little things, the locked cupboards, the intercepted mail, the carefully edited version of my life that they presented to the world. I started keeping notes, scribbling down dates and conversations, details that others thought I might forget. Each entry was a small act of defiance, a way to remind myself that I was still here, still aware, still fighting. One afternoon, while helping with the garden despite the restrictions, I overheard a conversation between my daughter and a neighbor. They spoke in hushed tones about her memory slipping and the need for intervention. The words were like poison, cutting through the fragile veil of civility. I realized then that they were planning to take away more than just my belongings and my freedom. They wanted to take away my voice, my agency, and my dignity. But I would not go quietly. I began to think of ways to reclaim my life, to push back against the slow erasure. I reached out to an old friend who lived nearby, someone who had always treated me with kindness and respect. I started attending a local community center, where I met women like me, women who had been pushed to the margins but refused to be forgotten. There, I found a glimmer of hope, a reminder that I was not alone. The first escalations were subtle, almost invisible to those who chose not to see. But for me, they were the cracks in the foundation of my life, the first signs that the house I had called home was no longer mine. Each lost possession, each whispered comment, each avoided glance was a blow to my spirit, but also a call to action. I realized that to survive, I needed to stop waiting for them to welcome me back and start making a way forward on my own terms. The rain that had once soaked me to the bone that stormy night became a symbol of renewal. Just as the earth drinks the rain to grow, I would take these moments of loss and transform them into strength. The path ahead would not be easy, and the wounds would take time to heal, but I was determined. I was still here, still standing, and I would find my way back to the light, no matter how long it took. One afternoon, as I was quietly tidying the garage, an area I had once taken pride in maintaining, I stumbled upon something that would change everything. Tucked away behind a stack of old paint cans and dusty boxes was a folder, worn at the edges but unmistakably familiar. I pulled it out carefully, the paper crackling softly in my hands. It was the original deed to the house, with my name boldly printed alongside my late husband's. For a moment, the weight of years pressed down on me. The sacrifices, the quiet work, the steady contributions I had made, often unnoticed, but always real. I remembered how my husband and I had used his life insurance payout to help buy this home, to create a safe place for our family, to build a future. Holding that folder, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Power. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Here was proof that I was not just a guest or a shadow in this house, but a rightful owner. Yet, it also meant that the people who had been so quick to shut me out had been trying to erase my existence without cause. This discovery was a quiet rebellion, a line drawn beneath years of pain and silencing. I tucked the deed carefully into my coat pocket, knowing that it was more than paper. It was a symbol of my claim, my history, and my worth. From that day on, I began to act with a newfound resolve. I started to keep a small notebook where I recorded every incident that chipped away at my dignity. The intercepted letters, the subtle dismissals, the controlling conversations. Writing became a way to reclaim my story, to hold on to the truth when others tried to rewrite it. Each entry was a reminder that I was not losing my mind, that my experiences were real, and that I deserved to be heard. Slowly, I began to push back against the isolation. I reached out to old friends I had lost touch with, sending letters and making quiet phone calls. I joined a local community group where others my age gathered to share stories and support each other. For the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of connection and purpose beyond the walls that had once confined me. It was not a grand awakening, but a gentle turning, a recognition that life could still hold meaning and that I still had the strength to shape it. In the evenings, I would sit by the window, the deed resting on the table beside my knitting basket. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows, and the world moved on as if unaware of my quiet rebellion. But inside, I was changing. The woman who had been silenced and sidelined was beginning to find her voice again. I began to speak up during family gatherings, carefully choosing words that carried the weight of my experience without anger or accusation. It was a delicate dance, balancing assertion with diplomacy, but each small victory bolstered my confidence. One particularly meaningful moment came when I confronted my daughter about the locked cupboards and the missing mail. I spoke calmly but firmly, showing her the notebook where I had documented the changes. Her face hardened, but something in my steady gaze made her pause. It was not a triumphant confrontation, but a turning point, a moment where the silence between us was broken, and the truth could no longer be ignored. Around the same time, I began to prepare for a larger step, seeking legal advice. The deed was my key, but I knew that reclaiming my rights would require more than memories and notes. With the help of a neighbor who volunteered at a local senior advocacy group, I found an attorney who specialized in elder rights. Meeting with her was both daunting and empowering. She listened patiently, validated my experiences, and explained the options available to me. For the first time, I felt the possibility of justice and autonomy flicker on the horizon. This period was not without setbacks or moments of doubt. There were days when the weight of years pressed so heavily that I wanted to retreat into silence again, to fold into the role I had been assigned. But the deed in my pocket, the notebook on my lap, and the small community I was building around me kept me moving forward. The storm that had once left me drenched and abandoned was now a memory, a catalyst for change. In the quiet moments before sleep, I often thought about the fuse box in the garage, the heart of the house's power. I imagined what it would feel like to hold that power in my hands, to control the light and the darkness, to remind them that without me, there was no electricity, no life in those walls. It was a symbol of the control they sought to take from me and the control I was beginning to reclaim. The thought brought a small, fierce smile to my lips. I realized that this was not just about a house or a family. It was about reclaiming myself piece by piece, stitch by stitch. It was about refusing to be erased or forgotten, about standing firm even when the world tried to push me down. The deed was not merely a legal document. It was a beacon, guiding me through the fog of doubt and fear toward a future I would choose for myself. This was my turning point, not a dramatic escape or confrontation, but a steady, quiet assertion of my right to exist and to be respected. The woman who had been left outside in the storm was beginning to rise again, not because she had to, but because she chose to, and that choice made all the difference. The days following my quiet assertion of my rights marked a new, harsher chapter in the family's treatment of me. I had hoped that by showing them I was aware and capable, by keeping my records and seeking legal advice, they might reconsider their approach, maybe even reach out with a modicum of respect or understanding. Instead, the walls around me grew thicker, the atmosphere colder, as if my small acts of defiance had pushed them into a corner they did not want to occupy. The subtle erasures I had endured before became more blatant and painful, a relentless pressure testing the limits of my resolve. It began with the sudden arrival of a lawyer, a man I had never met before, yet whose name became a shadow that darkened every interaction in the house. He was formally dressed, his demeanor polite but distant, as if he had been sent not to offer support but to deliver a message. My daughter introduced him at a family gathering, a forced smile masking the tension beneath. "This is Mr. Bennett," she said. "He's here to discuss some important matters with you, Mom." The words were clinical, devoid of warmth, and they echoed with an unsettling finality. Mr. Bennett sat across from me in the living room, his briefcase resting on his lap like a barrier. He spoke in measured tones about transitioning care and planning for the future, phrases that sounded benign but carried a heavy weight. They wanted me to consider signing over power of attorney, relinquishing control over my finances and health decisions. The suggestion was framed as concern for my well-being, but I felt it as a threat, a way to strip away the last remnants of my independence. I looked at him steadily, refusing to be intimidated, and told him I needed time to think. That evening, as I sat alone in the quiet of my room, the reality of their intentions settled over me like a storm cloud ready to burst. This was no longer about care or protection. It was about control and exclusion. They were orchestrating a takeover, erasing me piece by piece. The house, once a place of family and warmth, had become a battleground where I was fighting to keep my dignity and my life. The days that followed were fraught with tension. My daughter's visits grew less frequent, her words more clipped. She spoke around me, not to me, making decisions as if I were absent. I found myself barred from conversations about the home and finances, told to trust them because they knew what was best. But trust had been shattered long ago. Each new exclusion was a reminder that I was becoming invisible, a burden to be managed rather than a person to be loved. In the midst of this, a small act of kindness offered a fragile lifeline. One afternoon, the mail carrier, a kindly woman named Ruth, who had noticed my letters were no longer arriving, slipped a few envelopes into my hands as she passed the door. She did so quietly, with a glance that said she understood without needing words. Those letters, old friends' notes, bills, and a few postcards, were a small rebellion against the erasure I faced. They reminded me that beyond the walls of the house, there was still a world that recognized me, that cared. But the family's pressure only intensified. They arranged a medical assessment without my full consent, sending a nurse to evaluate my mental acuity and physical health. The questions were polite but probing, and the report that followed was used as justification for their plans. The nurse noted mild cognitive decline and occasional forgetfulness, phrases that, taken out of context, painted a picture of vulnerability and incapacity. My daughter seized on this report, presenting it as evidence that I needed supervision, that my autonomy was a risk to my safety. One evening, During a particularly tense dinner, my daughter announced plans for a formal meeting to discuss next steps, a euphemism that sent chills down my spine. The family lawyer would be present, along with the nurse and a social worker from the local elder care agency. The invitation was thinly veiled as an opportunity for me to participate in decisions about my care. But I knew better. It was a gathering designed to finalize their takeover. The day of the meeting arrived with a storm outside, a reflection of the turmoil within me. The room was cold and sterile, with chairs arranged in a semicircle that felt more like a tribunal than a family discussion. The faces around me were familiar yet distant, allies turned adversaries. The lawyer spoke first, outlining the legal framework for power of attorney and guardianship, emphasizing safety and well-being. The nurse presented her findings, careful to couch them in clinical terms, but with an undercurrent of urgency. The social worker offered services and support, her tone gentle but firm. When it was my turn to speak, I felt the weight of years behind me, the love, the sacrifices, the quiet strength that had carried me through loss and hardship. I spoke calmly, asserting my right to remain autonomous, to make my own decisions as long as I was able. I shared stories of my daily routines, the friends I had reconnected with, the plans I was making. My voice did not tremble, though inside, I was fierce with the need to be heard. The room was silent, the tension palpable. Afterward, the lawyer and social worker conferred quietly, and my daughter looked at me with a mixture of frustration and sorrow. It was clear they were prepared to escalate if necessary, to use legal means to remove me from control. The message was unmistakable: compliance or confrontation. In the days that followed, I felt the noose tightening. Phone calls from the lawyer increased. Letters arrived outlining proposed actions, and my daughter's demeanor shifted between impatience and sorrowful resignation. Yet, amidst this pressure, I found unexpected strength. The notebook I had kept became a testament to my awareness, a record of every interaction, every slight, every attempt to undermine me. I shared it with my attorney, who advised me on my rights and the steps I could take to protect myself. I also discovered allies in unexpected places. The local community center, where I had begun volunteering, connected me with an elder advocacy group. They provided resources, guidance, and most importantly, a voice. Through them, I learned that I was not alone in this struggle, that many others faced similar battles against family members and systems determined to strip them of dignity. One afternoon, while meeting with my attorney, I made a decision that would change everything. I would not allow them to take the house from me, to erase my ownership and my legacy. I would fight for my place in this world, for my right to live on my own terms. The house deed was my shield and my sword, a symbol of all I had endured and all I still had to offer. But before the legal battle could begin, I took a symbolic and irrevocable action. Late one night, after everyone was asleep, I went to the garage where the main electrical panel was located. With deliberate care, I removed the main fuse from the box, holding it in my hand as if it were a key to my freedom. I left a note taped beside the empty slot. "Without me, there is no light." Then I slipped quietly out of the house, leaving behind the walls that had imprisoned me for too long. That night marked the turning point. The family awoke to darkness and confusion, a literal and figurative blackout that could not be ignored. The power outage forced them to confront the consequences of their actions, the fragility of their control. Meanwhile, I found refuge with an old friend who welcomed me with open arms, offering shelter and a safe space to rebuild. From that moment forward, I embraced the fight ahead with renewed determination. I engaged legal counsel, filed challenges to the power of attorney, and began the slow process of reclaiming my life. It was a difficult path, filled with setbacks and emotional wounds, but each step was a reclaiming of my dignity and my autonomy. The battle was not only legal but deeply personal. It tested my resilience, my courage, and my capacity to forgive. It forced me to confront not only my family, but also my own fears and doubts. Through it all, I discovered a well of strength I had long forgotten, a flame that burned brighter with every challenge. And so, the second escalation was not just an intensification of conflict, but a crucible that forged me anew. The woman who had been left outside in the storm was now a force to be reckoned with, a guardian of her own fate, unyielding and proud. The fuse box was gone, but the light it represented shone brighter than ever within me. The moment I sent that letter was the moment I reclaimed my power in a way they could not undo. I had spent weeks building my case quietly, gathering documents, consulting with my attorney, and preparing myself for the confrontation I knew was inevitable. But the letter was different. It was not a plea or negotiation. It was a declaration, a boundary drawn with ink and conviction. It read clearly and coldly, "I am of sound mind, living in a safe environment, and not under duress. Any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern will be considered harassment." I signed it with a steady hand, sealed the envelope, and mailed it without hesitation. The fuse was lit, not with anger, but with clarity. In the days that followed, I felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. There was no immediate response from my daughter or the lawyer, just a silence that stretched and grew heavy. I knew this was not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter where I set the terms. I had refused to be silenced, refused to be controlled, and in doing so, I had taken the first step toward true freedom. The house I had lived in, fought for, and been slowly pushed out of was no longer my battlefield. Instead, I built a new life, one grounded not in old walls or familiar faces, but in the quiet certainty of self-respect and independence. I moved into a small apartment with the help of friends and community services, a modest space but my own. The rooms were not grand, but they held the promise of new beginnings. The light came through the windows, unfiltered and bright, a daily reminder that I was no longer in the shadows. I found work volunteering at a local community center, teaching knitting and sharing stories with other women who had their own battles and triumphs. The work was humble, but it filled a void I hadn't realized was there. For the first time in years, I felt useful on my own terms, not because I was expected to give, but because I chose to. The small paycheck I earned was mine entirely, a tangible proof of my agency. I bought myself a radio, the first thing I had purchased for pleasure in a long time, and it became a companion in quiet evenings. My relationship with my daughter remained fractured, but the distance no longer cut as deeply. I had accepted that some wounds might never fully heal, and that was a peace in itself. I wrote a final letter to her, brief and clear. "I know what you did and what you did not say. I am not angry. I am done waiting. Take care of your own life now." I mailed it with a stamp that had a small bird on it, a finch, the kind that sings even in the cold. It was a symbol of resilience, of finding voice in silence. That night, I sat by the window in my new home, wrapped in a warm shawl, the letter resting beside me. The world outside was quiet, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. I felt a calm I had not known in years, a sense of completion that was not the absence of pain, but the presence of strength. I was no longer waiting for permission or approval. I was whole on my own. The legal battle continued in the background, with letters exchanged and hearings scheduled, but the real victory had already been won in that quiet moment of self-assertion. The house, the lawyer, the family's control, they were parts of a past I was no longer tethered to. The fuse box I had taken was more than metal and wires. It was a symbol of a choice to cut the power they held over me and to illuminate a new path forward. In this new life, I discovered the richness of small joys. A cup of tea brewed just the way I liked it, the laughter of new friends, the feel of yarn slipping through my fingers as I knit. I learned to trust myself again, to listen to my own needs and desires, and to honor the woman I had become. The storm that once threatened to drown me was now behind me, a memory softened by time and tempered by resilience. I kept the letter I wrote to my daughter tucked safely away, a reminder of the moment I chose myself. I did not need their approval or their love to define my worth. I was my own guardian, my own advocate, and my own light. And in that, I found freedom. The days that followed my declaration of independence were quieter than I expected, not because the storm had passed, but because I had learned to carry it differently. There was no grand reconciliation, no dramatic reunion. Instead, there was a slow unfolding of peace, a peace born not of forgetting or forgiving, but of accepting what was and choosing what would be. I settled into my small apartment with a sense of calm that surprised me, a quiet confidence that came from knowing I was no longer waiting for anyone's permission to live my life. The routine of my new days brought a comforting rhythm. Mornings began with sunlight spilling through the curtains and the soft hum of the city waking up beyond my window. I brewed tea in my chipped porcelain cup and listened to the radio, the voices and music filling the quiet spaces in the room. Afternoons were often spent at the community center, where I taught knitting to eager hands, sharing more than just stitches. I shared stories of survival, resilience, and hope. The women I met there were kindred spirits, each carrying their own battles and triumphs. Together, we wove a tapestry of strength that wrapped around us like a warm shawl. Though the ache of loss never fully left me, the absence of family ties, the weight of past betrayals, I found solace in new connections and in the steady reclaiming of my autonomy. Letters from old friends arrived sporadically, their words a balm for the soul. I wrote back when I could, my handwriting steady and sure. The phone, once a source of anxiety and unwanted demands, remained mostly silent, its presence reduced to an object rather than a tether. I chose when and how to engage with the world, and that choice was a freedom I cherished. One afternoon, a letter arrived that stirred a gentle hope. It was from my grandson, the one who had always shown kindness amidst the family's coldness. His words were simple but sincere, expressing a desire to reconnect on his own terms, without pressure or expectation. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on my windowsill, where the sunlight warmed it throughout the day. It was a fragile bridge, but a bridge nonetheless, a sign that some wounds could heal and that new beginnings were possible, even if they looked different than I had once imagined. In quiet moments, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The locked door in the storm, the lawyer's cold words, the removal of the fuse, the acts of exclusion and defiance that had defined those difficult months now felt like steps in a dance I had learned to lead. I realized that I had not simply survived. I had transformed. The woman who once stood shivering in the rain was now a woman who stood tall in her own light, unafraid and unbowed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, I sat on my small balcony wrapped in a soft shawl. The air was cool, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine from a neighbor's garden. I held a pen in my hand and a blank card before me. I wrote slowly, the words flowing from a place deep within. Dear friend, if you find yourself lost in silence or shadow, remember this: there is always a light within you waiting to be kindled. Do not wait for permission to shine. Be your own beacon in the darkness. Stand firm, speak your truth, and walk boldly toward the life you deserve. I sealed the card and placed it in an envelope, knowing it was not just a message to another woman like me, but a promise to myself. The path had not been easy, and there were still moments of loneliness and doubt, but I had learned that strength often comes in quiet persistence. I was no longer waiting for a perfect sign or a grand gesture. I was my own sign, my own noise in the silence. As night settled over the city, I looked out at the twinkling lights below, each one a story, a life, a choice. My story was still unfolding, not defined by those who had tried to diminish me, but by the woman I had become, resilient, free, and fully alive. And in that truth, I found a peace that no storm could take away.